What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Time with Steel Garage. I'm Jimmy, and this time we're going to start building our brand new 2JZ home rebuild engine with all new parts. And I'm going to do that by starting out with some brand new pistons and rods and assembling them on a nice oak table in my house just to test my wife's patience. You know, like raptors do on the fence in Jurassic Park. All right, stay tuned. It's at this point where you're saying, well, Jimmy, I thought you said this was a budget build. And, well, it is a budget build. I decided that I didn't want to be worried about rods after putting all this time and effort in the motor, and I already had it torn down, so now's the best time than ever to change it. The factory NA rods are toothpicks, and they're good for about 450 horsepower. I'm building this motor in a way that I can go higher than that if I want to. My target's 400 to 500 horsepower, but I don't want to be worried about the rods. So with budget in mind, I called Real Street, got the cheapest rods for a 2J that are forged, and I got K1 rods. Now they say they're good for 185 horsepower per cylinder. So these forged rods are good for a 1,000 horsepower 2J, which is far beyond where I'm going to take it. They've got oiling holes in them. They're H-beam style for low end torque, and they are phenomenal. On the piston side, I also, with a budget in mind, was able to score a set of factory new GT pistons from a cool guy. So all in all, about $1,000 for forged bottom end. So it's pretty budget, because most of the time for pistons, rods, and rings, you're looking at about $1,500. So comes with the Toyota piston, and these part numbers will be in the spreadsheet in the description portion of the video. But your piston comes with a new pin, 2 C-clips, and your rods come lined up, weighed, with their connecting rods, connecting caps attached, and they also have ARP 2000 hardware. So what I do is I lay it all out. This is rod number 6, and the first thing I'm going to do is actually label the rod and all the parts for this piston as the number 6 cylinder, including the cap, so that when I have this stuff all apart, I don't mix it up, because these caps and rods go together. You can't switch them. Now the cool thing about the Toyota piston is it has a dot on it that makes it obvious which way goes forward. And then also underneath they put a little green paint dot so you don't have to flip it over to see which side's the forward side of the piston. But because I'm not that intelligent, I like to make it obvious. I label each one. So this one's number 6, and I put an arrow on it so I know exactly what I'm doing. And as far as the clips, they're pretty simple. You got to maintain positive control of them, or they will shoot you in the eyeball or fly across the room. But I like to do everything the same. So that's pretty much how this goes. Is I lay all the parts out: piston rod, or new pin and rod, and the 2 C-clips. Take a little assembly lube. You don't need a lot, because lubricate both sides. And lubricate the rod. And I don't put a lot on the piston or on the pin itself, but everything has a light coat of lubrication on it. Now, to make it easy and the same on every one, what I've been doing is taking the forward side of the piston, the one with the green dot, first, and putting the C-clip in on that side first. And instead of using a flat blade screwdriver, I'm using a little 1/4 inch drive 5/32 socket, because it's rounded and it's not going to gouge if I miss. So I take the C-clip and I push it, the open end of the C-clip, into the groove, kind of spread it in, get it started, hold it with my one hand, pop it in until I hear it click. Now, when there's no rod in there and pin to support it, the bottom of the C-clip will tend to not go in the groove. So you gotta check all the way around the groove to make sure the clip's fully installed. Then take the piston, make sure it's oriented to the right for me, as forward of the engine. Take the pin, and I like to get it started on one side. Now these factory Toyota pistons and pins are tight. Then you get that in as whatever method you like. And then once you press the pin in, you just pop the clip on the other side, and that's it. It's done. And then you end up looking like this. Alright, so press that in. Confirm that I got my rod facing the right direction, which on these, I think these are unidirectional, but generally speaking, you want the, if there's not a mark on the rod, you want the lettering of the company that they've printed on the rod facing forward to the engine. So now we're going to take the remaining clip, spread the open end at the bottom, get it started, take the socket, pop her in. Easier said than done. These things are not fun. Just make sure you don't shoot your eye out. And there we go, we're in. So number 6 piston and rod, factory Supra turbo, brand new piston, K1 Industries forged rod. And that's it. Welcome back. So what we have here is the 2JZ GE VVTi naturally aspirated number 6 piston and rod that I pulled out of the motor, and the new forged Supra, factory Supra GTE engine turbo piston with forged K1 connecting rod. Now right away you can see that this H-beam style rod is wide all the way down, and here this rod gets very narrow here, and this is where they tend to snap under boost. Also, you can see that the pistons themselves are different. The piston is physically larger on the turbo side, and then the top of the pistons are different. Now this piston on the left here, the NA piston, is meant for higher compression. And this one on the right is the lower compression 8.5 to 1 versus the 10 to 1 NA motor, but meant for a turbo, and it's a stronger piston. Semi-forged, I think, is what the community calls them, but either way, substantially different. And you can also see the thickness and the width of the rod. So it was worth the upgrade while I was in there. I'm pretty excited about this because now the motor will no longer be limited. I can pretty much, it's going to be limited based off the ECU and the fuel system. With the turbo that I have and the way that I'm building the motor, if I want more power, I can just turn the screws up. So let's talk piston rings. So, standard piston rings. You have a compression ring, a number 2 compression ring, an oiler ring, an oil expander ring, and a secondary oiler ring. Typically, the piston ring will have a dot or an N or a number on it to let you know which side is up. On these 2J pistons, the number 1 ring is labeled with a 1N right there on the corner, and also typically the number 1 compression ring is the hardest ring, and it's also skinnier than the number 2 compression ring. They also typically have a slight bevel up, and not always. And then the number 2 ring is a little bit softer, it's a little bit wider, and it has an obvious bevel that faces down. And on this one, it says 2N. Anyways, you always want the dot or the N or the number facing up. And your number 1 and number 2 oil rings are the skinniest rings, and they have no bevel on them, they're flat. And basically your number 1 compression ring bevels up as the piston comes up in the bore. Your number 2 compression ring bevels down as the piston goes down in the bore. and your number 1 and number 2 oiler rings are flat, and they just scrape the oil off the cylinder wall as it goes up and down. So here's what I do. Again, I use my wife's table, and first thing I do is I write down factory spec. For me, I wanted to be loose spec plus a few thousandths. So for my rings, I want to file to 18, 21, and 17 thousandths. Okay. Now, all these rings are brand new factory Toyota, and I know there are guys out there that just throw the rings in and go, but there are variances in rings. So, for example, I've had as low as 0.12 thousandths on an oiler ring, and as high as 0.15 thousandths on an oil ring. So 3 thousandths difference. And number 1 compression rings, I've gone 0.016 down to 0.015, all the way down to 0.014. And all of my number 2 rings have been 0.20 or 0.21. So I think, you know, filing is the way to go, even if you're doing factory spec, just to get them all the same. And you can see I write down what I measure each one at, and then I write down what I grind it to. Well, in this situation, the oiler ring, or the number 2 compression ring, was exactly where I wanted it. So we have one piston left to do, and I'm going to show you how to do the number 1 compression ring so it doesn't take an hour. And by the way, to do all 6 cylinders is taking me about 3 hours. Alright, so lube up your cylinder. I bring the piston out of the cylinder I'm working on, and I use that to push the rings down, mainly so I don't forget what cylinder I'm working on. So you lube your cylinder down with some W40, lube the ring down, make sure you've got the one end facing up. I face the direction I'm working, I call that 12 o'clock. So I take the open end of the ring and I push it down into the bore and then squeeze it till the back, and well, there she popped out. Squeeze it till the ring is holding itself in there on its own. And the crack in the ring is generally facing the 12 o'clock. And then I take the piston sideways. I put a finger in one pin bore and a thumb in another pin bore. And I bring the piston down evenly until both my finger and the thumb touch the head surface, or the deck. And now I'm going to take a measurement. Now, I'm guessing probably 14 thousandths. And I want to be at 18 thousandths. So I just start there, my 14 clears, and 15 is in there. Let's see where we're at on number 16. Alright, so I did have to hone this cylinder a little bit more, so I'm at 16 thousandths to start, and I want to go to 18 thousandths. So there's what she looks like when she's down in the bore. And you don't want to have your measurement, you don't want the ring to be towards the top of the bore, because there is a little bit of a bevel there, if you can see. So now we're just going to pop this bad boy out and start filing. Alright, now this ring filer here is, I think I got this from Jegs. They're all pretty much the same. Generally, the rule of thumb is if you have good contact on the ring, 1 revolution is 1/1000th. This one's kind of crappy, so I get the ring so it's both ends are touching on my stops here. Put a little pressure on the back of the ring. Put just a hair pressure on the ring into the carbide disc, and then I'm going to rotate counterclockwise or towards me, towards the inside of the ring. Okay, now I need to take 2 thousandths of material off. Let's see. Now you want to inspect your ring and make sure you're not cutting at an angle. If you are and you catch it early enough, you can fix it. Alright, let's see what that got us. So again, number 6 cylinder, my number 1 on N is on the facing up on the ring. Push the ring down in the bore. Take my piston, set it. Now, if there's ever any doubt if the ring is square or if you drag your feeler gauge in the ring and you mess it up, just take the ring out and reset it, remeasure. Obviously you want this to be right. the first time, because once you take the material off, you can't put it back. All right, so there's 16 thousandths, 17 thousandths, and I want 18. Perfect. I got that ring right the first time. So I'll show you here. Just taking your feeler gauge and very gently, you should feel just a little bit of friction. And there she is, 18 thousandths. All right, so I come in here, go to my sweet cardboard chart. My number one measured at 0.16 factory, and I brought her out to 0.18, which was my goal. And it allows me to double check everything if I forget. Take that ring and I put her to the bottom of the pile. Now I'm going to work on number 2. Once you get all the rings done, I put a check mark next to the cylinders when they're done. I'm going to take some Jewlers files and I'm going to just knock anything that I can feel with my finger off the ring. I'm not going to bevel the ring. I'm just going to knock any excess metal shavings that I can feel with my fingers off the rings. Okay, a couple more things on rings. Every single ring is a different hardness. So your number 1, your number 2, and your oiling rings are all different hardness of material. Also depending on what manufacturer you got your rings from. These are factory Toyota rings, but generally each ring is a different hardness, so they all cut differently. So you can't really just get used to, you know, grinding on a number 1 ring and then go to that same feel of the number 2 ring. You'll probably take too much material off of it. So treat each ring as a new material, and generally once I get to within a thousandths of where I want it to be, I do very fine adjustments and I check multiple times until I get it right. So that's and then also one last tip, your oiling rings are unbelievably thin and easy to break. So measuring them is easy to get wrong, because if you stick the feeler gauge in the gap on the ring and it has any kind of friction on it, it will pull the ring. So especially with the oiling rings, make sure you reseat the ring each time. Make sure that you visibly don't see a gap, okay? And take multiple measurements on the oiling rings because they're easy to get wrong. And that's enough talk on rings. All right, well, let's put some piston rings on. So I saved the number 6 just like I have been for this whole video. I'm gonna wipe the piston with some ATF, give it a decent clean. Make sure there's nothing inside the bores that the rings go into. Got my number 6 ring pack here. First thing I'm going to do is start out with the oil expander ring, just kind of gently run it across that ATF. I'm going to put that in the bottom. A little bit too far, there we go. Okay, she's in her home, she's spinning. Grab my oil rings here, clean it. You'd be surprised how much gray matter comes off on these. So I like to start gapping them as I install them. So I'm going to take this corner here, start it underneath the oil expander ring, kind of rotate it around the outside of the piston, and drop it in its home. There we are. Jeez. Okay. Still spinning freely. Clean the next oil ring. Now, since I have that one facing at the 2 o'clock, I'm going to start this one over here at the 10 o'clock on top of the expander ring. Inchworm it around the outside of the piston, hold it off piston here if I can. There we go. Now this whole assembly should be able to easily spin, and it does. Take my little Sharpie here. I'm going to leave myself a little dot on these sides of the piston so I know that my oil expander rings are already gapped. I'm going to go to this side. gonna go to my number 2 compression ring, make sure I am number 2 up. I am. Gonna clean it. Alright, she's clean. I got my handy dandy ring expander tool. I got this from my buddy and neighbor Dennis. This thing's old school, looks like a little butterfly. Okay, my number 2's up. I'm gonna start here at 10 o'clock position, get the open end of the ring started in its groove, start expanding here. There we are. Same thing, I'm going to make sure it spins freely. Alright, number 2's on, and then I'm going to double check that the number 2 is facing up. It is. Can't do that too many times, because if it faces the wrong direction, your motor is not going to be happy. Okay. Don't see my number 1. There I do. Okay, now that one was upside down, so that's why you check. Alright, so I got my number 2 over here at the 10 o'clock position. I'm going to go over here to the 2 o'clock position. Do the same thing. The top groove, get it started. Alright, there she is. Now I'm going to take the whole assembly and make sure it moves freely. Double check my gaps again. And put my dots, and then before I put it back on the table, I just like to see that the letters are facing up on the rings and everything is happy. So that's it. That's how we put the rings on the piston. Now it's important to note, if at any time you can't easily move the rings, I mean like easily, no friction at all, there's a problem. So this number 4 piston and rod, I had an issue with my oil expander and my 2 oil rings where it was not easy to turn. I took it apart, cleaned it out twice, and I couldn't figure out what the problem was, and then I actually found a defect in the piston. There was a piece of metal casting bump right here where this recess is for the pin, so I imagine when it was machined it got pushed a little bit, or maybe in shipping, I don't know, but I had to take a Jewlers File and just kind of flatten that spot of the ring land so that the rings didn't have a friction point, and now I can turn this whole assembly very easily. If you can't like lightly touch these rings and move them, it's a problem. I mean, when this motor's running, these rings are spinning. If they can't spin, they bind, and binding rings, especially in high boost motors, leads to broken rings and broken ring lands and taking the motor back apart. So I really don't want to do that. I mean, it still might fail in the first 15 seconds of me starting it, but I'm going to give it my best shot. Alright, hand polished the crank with 400 grit, then polished it with some Brasso, cleaned out the oil passageways with carb cleaner, hit it in the parts cleaner, soaked it with WD-40, and then bagged it for install. Dude, check it out. It's a very exciting morning. We're about to be putting new parts in. And it's game day. Bengals Bills. I'm dressed appropriately. So, crank's cleaned up. I'm going to start by putting main bearings in the crank galley. And we're going to keep them dry, or I'm going to clean them. Then I'm going to put them in there dry. And I'm going to set the crank in there dry very carefully. I'm not going to worry about the thrust bearings. And we're going to go ahead and plastigauge the mains to check for clearance. The right way to do it is bores gauges, but I'm doing it the easy way, which is plastigauge, and that's a very widely debated topic. Guys that build engines professionally will probably use plastigauge and measure. So just be aware that plastigauge can lie if there's defects in the cylinders. So, okay, continuing. Alright, so I've already cleaned all the galley here. On this engine, the very first bearing is wider. It's very obvious. They come packed that way to make sure that you understand, but bearing has a little tang on it, and all you got to do is line that tang up in the block and push the bearing in. It's pretty simple. That's it. First bearing's in. I'm going to keep on going down the line. I'm wiping the back of the bearing with Marvel Mystery Oil and then drying it off just to make sure they're clean and there's nothing that's going to mess with my oil clearances. And then once they're all installed, I'll gently wipe the front of the bearings with nothing. And I'm using ACL standard bearings because I'm not going for horsepower in this motor, high horsepower. I'm going for longevity. I'm really not going to be pushing that much power than the stock Supra can handle with stock bearings. So I chose regular bearings, and there's going to be a lot of people that watch this video and go, man, you should have used race bearings. Well, we'll find out. It is very cool to be putting brand new parts in this motor. Okay, like I said, I'm not putting the thrust bearings in because I don't need the thrust bearings to measure the main clearances with that plastigauge. And I'm going to have to pull the crank back out once I put the plastigauge in anyhow. So for now, we're just getting the mains in, which they are. And you can see the oil squirting side is the side you want down. Obviously it lines up with the holes in the block to feed oil to the crank. For the crank to go in its home, it's the first time since being cleaned and all stripped apart. Back through with a dry towel and just dry the top of where the main caps are going to sit so that I have a perfectly dry surface for that plastigauge. I want to make sure there's no issues with that. So we get. Alright, so here you can see plastigauge just comes in this little plastic or paper envelope that also has your measurements on it, and you just cut pieces off to size, and that's what it looks like. Just a little green, like wax strip. And then you lay it across the top of each place you want to measure. You just want to make sure you don't disrupt the plastigauge. And then obviously you want to try not to turn the crank. Well, moment of truth now. Take them off and see what the plastigauge tells us. Alright, there it is. There's my plastigauge, smushed. And the good thing is they all look pretty much the same. And it's pretty much, you can measure inches or millimeters, and standard spec is 0.001 to 0.0016, and we're right there at 0.0015. I went through and measured them all. They all are pretty much the same. So standard oil clearance 0.0010 to 0.0016. So we're right there on the loose side, which is better than being on the tight side. And then the acceptable range is to go all the way out to 0.0024 inch. So 0.0024 inch would be somewhere between here and here. And we're more like here. So we're good to go. We know our oil clearance on the mains is good. Now I'm going to go ahead and pull the crank. Do everything I just did, except I'm going to actually lube up all the bearings, install the thrust washers, and permanently install the crank. Alright, crank is in there. I think 33 foot-pounds plus an additional turn with 90, and mark the head bolts with some white so I can make sure they all got torqued. And this is the important part. I borrowed this rod vise from my buddy Donnie. Absolutely must have tool for taking brand new rods apart. Don't skimp on this step. Once again, use plastigauge to ensure proper bearing clearance on the rods. All right, welcome back. So we have arrived at what, in my opinion, is the most exciting part of an engine build, other than hearing it run, which is putting the pistons in and actually making a rotating assembly. So this right here, I think, is a Wiseco brand 86mm fixed spring compressor. And let me tell you, this is one of those tools, just buy it. Whatever brand you like. But you see people on the YouTube and all over the place like fumbling around with those crappy, typical auto store screw-on ring compressors. I actually got this idea from watching Jay Marr Real Street's assembly videos. And when I saw him use this thing, I was just like, okay, I gotta have one of those. So here's why. I've confirmed my piston's facing the right direction. Just gradually push it down and then sharp push. That easy. Like literally zero messing around. And it's been that way for every piston I've installed. And then I just put my hand underneath the motor and then guide the piston onto the crank. Now, since this is a straight 6, I started with 3 and 4, moved to 2 and 5, and now I'm doing number 1, number 6 at the bottom of the stroke. Since it's a straight 6, there's always 2 cylinders that are at the bottom of the stroke. So it's that simple. And then the last thing I wanted to show you guys, this is your last time to look at this piston and make sure your pin's installed correctly, your C-clips are installed correctly, the rod's facing the right direction, the piston's facing the right direction. Each one of your rings spins freely, is gapped appropriately. And when I say gap, I mean that, you know, the gas gaps are separated. And it's just your last opportunity to know you're getting it right. So take your time, get it right. And then as far as that, once you got the piston in, I won't show you guys because I've already shown you, but plastigauge, just like I did on the crank, same process. Torque to spec dry. Check your plastigauge, scrape the plastigauge off, clean the bearings, lube up with lube, retorque everything down, and done. So I'm going to drop these last 2 pistons in and then I'll bring you back. And here you go. Those are the last 2 pistons, done and done. Would you look at that? It is a beautiful sight. And you know, all those little notes I took while making pistons and putting numbers on them and arrows, it just helps you confirm that you got it right. But I'm just going to turn her through a couple rotations here. I don't feel any binding. And I'm pretty stoked because the hard part's done. Yeah, it is pretty legit. Let's bring that number 1 to top. Man. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed that one, folks. Reassembly is pretty much the opposite of what I already shown you, but there's more good footage to come, and we'll see you next time. Go ahead and hit that subscribe, like button, share with your friends, hit the alert button, do all that good stuff. I appreciate the support. Thank you.